there then a massive unemployment problem that is not being reflected in the official data, in your opinion?
Thank you for having me. You see, it all depends on how you define it. The ILO's definition says that if you get a wage in the market, then you're employed. But the government of India's definition doesn't say that. It says that anybody working is employed. So therefore, the labor force participation rate, as it's called, that of the age group of 15 to 64, how many people are looking for jobs or how many people are working, right? Now, the ILO's definition, we get a figure of about 48, 49% according to CMIE, but government says 58%. But even 58% is much less than what other big economies like Brazil and China have, which is 65 to 70%. So in other words, India, even if you go by the official figure, has about 10 to 12% less people looking for work. They've given up working. So in other words, what we find is there are four kinds of unemployment in India. One is you're employed and you're getting a wage. Another is you're looking for work and not finding work. Third is that you're in the market, but you get only a few hours of work, so you're underemployed. And then you have the situation in agriculture and in trade, where the entire family is sitting there and doing something, but they're not contributing to GDP. This is called disguised unemployment. So if you total all this, then you have a huge number of people who either don't have any work or have very little work. So therefore, the government data doesn't reflect all this, and that's why their figure of unemployment comes to only about 5%. But if you count underemployment and disguised unemployment, then the figure is much, much higher than this 5 to 6% that the government projects.
There is massive dispersion then, isn't there? 5.6% in June. So is that, Arun, incorrect? And is the more realistic figure, given everything that you've enumerated, between 7 and 35%, which is huge dispersion? Where would you put it, if I can press you for a number?
So, it all depends on what you're counting. If you're counting disguised unemployment, you're counting underemployment, and if you're counting, those who have quit looking for work altogether, then the figure would be close to maybe 20% or so. If you don't count the underemployed, then the figure may be only around 10% or thereabouts. So in other words, it all depends on what definition is being used. And quite clearly, the government is using a definition which is favorable to itself. It is not counting other things, but the distress in the market is quite clear. There is huge unemployment amongst women and amongst the educated youth in the age group of 15 to 29. So therefore, we are concerned about this lack of employment for a large percentage of the population.
Arun, what is the risk then that unemployed youth and women, as you quite rightly mentioned, who are looking to enter the workforce, to just simply give up looking for jobs and drop out? In other words, at what point, or is this already happening, and to what extent, do unemployed workers become discouraged workers? And unless this is an issue that is addressed by policymakers and top-down policy approach, is this looking like a long-term problem?
It is a long-term problem for the following reason, that India has an organized sector and an unorganized sector. The organized sector is highly automated and mechanized, so it doesn't generate much job. And the unorganized sector has been hit very hard by demonetization, the GST, and the NBFC crisis and the pandemic. So 4 shocks to the unorganized sector, so it's been declining. And that is where more than 90% of the employment is. So if this unorganized sector gets hit hard and the government doesn't do enough to actually boost it, then what happens is that unemployment will persist. The organized sector will not generate jobs, and especially with AI coming, it will generate even fewer jobs. Therefore, the problem is to be tackled at a structural level. Unfortunately, the government is not doing that. As you rightly said, it has a top-down approach. It is promoting the organized sector, but not the unorganized sector. The unorganized sector consists of about 110 million farmers. It consists of about 60 million micro units. And that's where the bulk of the employment is. Now, those are the sectors that are suffering because of the fact that agriculture is getting more and more mechanized. There are more harvester combines and tractors and so on used. So agriculture is also not offering the kind of employment it should offer. And the trade sector is getting mechanized because e-commerce is rising at the expense of the local stores, the mom and pop stores in the locality. So therefore, there's a problem of unemployment that is growing. And the government's policies are skewed in favor of highly capital-intensive things like big
I
highways
see.
and big projects, etc. Whereas the employment-intensive rural employment guarantee scheme, education, health, there the budgets are typically cut. So where you could
Yes.
generate employment, the government cuts the budget. Where you cannot generate much employment, there you find the government's increasing its investment.
So it has to be all of the above in terms of the policy approach in the rural economy and in the urban centres, reforming the rural economy, moving the workforce there into more productive parts of the economy, making the rural economy more efficient. In the urban centres, scaling innovation, innovative industries and businesses leading to jobs, growth and a virtuous circle there. Is policy moving in that direction, Arun?
Unfortunately not, even though the government says that it will try and create jobs for the educated youth in the organized sector, but that's only temporary, and that's inadequate compared to what is required. What is required is to boost the micro sector. The micro sector, which is the 99% of the units of the MSME sector and 97.5% of the employment, that sector has been hit very hard by the demonetization and the other 3 steps that have been taken by the government. Now, if that sector declines, then quite clearly unemployment will rise because those people will have nowhere to go. So they will join the force of people who are not looking for work at all. And that has very bad effect because a lot of the young people, they're getting into substance abuse. They're watching their cell phones all the time, or they're getting into trouble. It has led to violence in the family, so it has social implications. It also has political implications because this unemployed youth is used by the political parties for its various purposes. So these are economic, political, and social implications of the fact that educated youth is not finding a work. And to give an example, for instance, for grade C and grade D railway jobs of 35,000, roughly about 13.5 million individuals applied. So you can see the extent of unemployment and the desperation in the youth.
Absolutely, Aaron. We saw this last year when we were reporting on the election, and the structural challenges with youth unemployment are very apparent. The conversation seems to be right now on trade, on generating trade deals, whether it's with the UK and the US-India trade deal is the holy grail, it seems. Do you think collectively these trade deals will help generate the FDI necessary to grow the share of manufacturing in the economy that we were talking about? And will that lead ultimately to improved job creation?
FDI is only about 5% of the total investment. Unfortunately, the Indian private sector is not investing enough. And that is because demand is inadequate. If the unorganized sector leads to a lot of unemployment, then the demand for mass market would be low. And that's why capacity utilization data from the RBI shows that capacity utilization has been hovering at about 70 to 75%. Whereas boost to investment will come from the private sector if it rises to 80, 85%. Now, to do that, we need to give incomes at the lower level where people are unemployed or underemployed or disguised unemployed. So in other words, this trade deals may get more FDI, but that will come into the organized sector where because of automation, mechanization, employment generation will not take place. So you can see that, in 1990 also about 94% of the workforce was unorganized. And even now about 94% of the workforce is unorganized. So in spite of 30, 40 years of investment, the unorganized sector has not been able to offer more employment. Rather, organized sector not being able to offer more employment, and therefore people are forced to go into the unorganized sector at very low productivity and very low wages. So in other words, we need a structural change. The free trade agreements and the bilateral agreements will not do that.
Arun, where is the private sector in all of this? Does the answer lie with what is, to all intents and purposes, a flourishing startup ecosystem in India? And do they need to move beyond services towards building advanced manufacturing that will create high-value, high-paying jobs for new graduates, and not just, as Commerce Minister has described, jobs for delivery boys and delivery girls?
Manufacturing also requires services. There are productive services and consumptive services. So, for instance, trade and storage and various other such services are required as production gets more concentrated. So we need to move on both fronts. We need to boost manufacturing as well as services. Now, unorganized sector also has manufacturing and services. And if you boost that, that is when you will get employment. If you boost only the organized sector, manufacturing and services, that will not generate much jobs. So we need to refocus our attention towards the unorganized sector, which is what, unfortunately, the government is not doing. And its various steps like digitization and demonetization, yes, they only led to the decimation of the unorganized sector. And that's why, for instance, if you look at the pressure cooker sector, there are 5 big units and 25 small units. The 5 big units were reported to be growing at 24%, whereas the unorganized sector is declining. Similar reports have come from leather goods sector, luggage industry, trade sector, and so on. So in other words, the government needs to focus attention, if employment is the focus, on the unorganized sector, which is the micro sector, and creating non-farm employment in the rural areas.
Very interesting perspectives, Arun. Thank you very much indeed for that. And India arguably is losing its best and brightest to overseas markets and needs to address that brain drain. We'll save that for another conversation, sir. Thank you. Arun Kumar there.
Thank you.
Coming up on the programme, we will discuss India's renewable energy ambitions after the short break.